Welcome back to Abnormal Psych Through Film. This is your host, John Martin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and master addictions counselor and a cinephile. I heard that word earlier this week, and like that, I've always loved movies. I can relate to movies. They have a way of kind of producing a fantasy world that can transcend kind of the stresses and anxieties of whatever's going on in your life. And since becoming a social worker and a therapist, I have kind of an eye in film for psychological themes, psychiatric disorders, and just these are both things I love talking about. So movies, psychology, I'm all in. So this week we're going to talk about Good Will Hunting, starring Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and of course the late great Robin Williams, directed by Gus Van Sant. Incredible movie. This is very, very well-known film. Won multiple Academy Awards, and I thought about this movie and the portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder in the main character, Will Hunting, played by Matt Damon. And I don't know, but people may not connect post-traumatic stress disorder to this character. But as I was watching the movie, I thought, oh wow, these are kind of some hallmark symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so before I get into the movie, I wanted to just introduce post-traumatic stress disorder, talk a little bit about what it is and how we diagnose this disorder. And so the term originally was shell shock, right, in the context of combat veterans who had experienced trauma at war. And so it wasn't officially recognized till about 1980 in the diagnostic manual as PTSD, right, post-traumatic stress. And this was born out of advocacy work with not only Vietnam vets, but Holocaust survivors. And so this kind of, then there was an onslaught of research into the disorder, and also recognizing that it's not just unique to combat. It's people that experience abuse, neglect, violence, sexual violence, adverse childhood experiences can go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Not everybody that experiences a trauma will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, what's necessary to diagnose PTSD is the event or the stressor has to have been a month or longer since the symptoms kind of remained. And so that suggests that it's actually normal, that these are actually normal reactions to an abnormal situation. But when they persevere, right, when they continue, then that's evidence of, okay, something is not recalibrating in the brain. Something is kind of stuck. And so that's where we end up with the diagnosis of the disorder. It's also important to note that PTSD has high comorbidities with things like anxiety disorders, mood disorders such as depression, and substance use disorders. So oftentimes when someone has PTSD, you're also going to be looking at other psychiatric problems. And so what is the diagnostic criteria for PTSD? Well, the first thing is you have to have a stressor or a traumatic event in and of itself. This is where kind of there are divergent views on what is trauma, right? Trauma is generally kind of a subjective term, right? A person gets to decide whether or not what they experienced was traumatic, right? Going through a divorce, going through a bad breakup, these kinds of things people may refer to as trauma. But when we're talking about the diagnostic and statistical manual, it has a pretty explicit definition It's a little more concise, and it kind of centers around a life or death event, right, where there was risk of serious injury or sexual violence, right? And this could be witnessing, learning, or experiencing one of these types of events. The key is proximity, right? So you have to be close to it, right? It can't be something you see on TV or something you heard about. There has to be some proximity to it. So there needs to be some type of stressor, some type of traumatic event. So then you move into, okay, what are the criteria? So the first one I'll talk about is avoidance. All right, so avoidance of memories, triggers, things that might remind them of the traumatic event, cues in the environment, feelings, sensations, anything that's tied to the traumatic event, right? There's this learned avoidance, right? I need to avoid situations where I might feel trapped because I was, trapped in an abusive relationship, etc. And so anything that cues that original trauma event, there's going to be avoidance, right? Emotional avoidance, where I'm going to really kind of duck and dodge any of these uncomfortable feelings that might be coming up in these situations. So then we have hypervigilance, hyperarousal, right? So this is consistent with what we know of kind of what's happening in the brain. You have the threat center in the brain, which is the amygdala, right? This is deeper in the brain, and it is what signals danger, right? Alert, 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 right? This is that part of the brain. So in PTSD, there's a overactive and hypersensitive amygdala, right? So it's getting turned on when there's no threat, in the absence of any kind of danger. And so this is creating a physiological and psychological experience of actual danger, even when there is no danger. Right? This can obviously be very problematic. Coupled with an underactive prefrontal cortex, right? This part of the brain that acts kind of as the governor, right? It keeps the speed going too high, right? This is underactive, right? So you put these two things together, and you have a nervous system that is in hyperdrive, right? So hypervigilance, hyperarousal. The third thing is intrusive thoughts, right? Or memories. So these are thoughts, memories, sensations, feelings that are happening to the person when they don't want them to be happening, right? They're kind of coming in at times where it's not convenient, it's not conducive, it's not helpful, right? And so these can be in the forms of flashbacks, memories, dreams, nightmares. And so these kind of, they keep coming in when it's really not appropriate or the person doesn't want them there. And finally, we have negative mood and negative thoughts. And so a person might have developed beliefs about themselves that are troublesome and not helpful and untrue, such as it's my fault, or I messed up, or I'm not safe, right? Things that, may or may not have been true at the time, but aren't consistent with where the person is today, yet they're applying those schemas to their present experience, right? And it's creating this skewed reality where everything is their fault, right? Or every situation is dangerous. And so part of the treatment is learning how to break down those schemas and to develop new beliefs about the self. And also negative mood, right? And this could look different. This could be depressive. This could be anxious. In the movie, you're going to see a lot of aggression, hostility, anger, even violence, right? These are negative affective states, negative mood states. And for Will in the movie, you're going to see anger as one of his coping strategies, right? So it also falls under avoidance, right? If I'm on the attack, if I'm on the offensive, right, I'm actually avoiding abandonment. I'm avoiding any situation where I might be vulnerable or taken advantage of. So these are kind of the main pieces of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we'll move into the film and kind of breaking down how post-traumatic stress disorder is on display. So to talk a little bit about the film, this was kind of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's rise to stardom, if you will. They were longtime friends who actually wrote the screenplay for this in Ben Affleck's mother's basement in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was actually it was a script for a play that Matt Damon wrote in a class at Harvard, and they came together and adapted it and turned it into what we know today. Of course, with Gus Van Sant, who's the director, kind of made some changes and ultimately adapted it to the screen. But it was kind of born out of their idea for the film, and so their friendship is embodied in the film. But then you have Robin Williams. Robin Williams is, in my opinion, this is his best performance. It's the only Oscar that he has. He won Best Supporting Actor for this film. It is truly magnificent, truly magnificent. You know, you have a comedic actor who he infuses some comedy in the film, but he plays a really central character who is wrestling with really kind of serious, important themes and is able to help Will as he's going through a really, really difficult process. And so, yeah, Robin Williams is just fabulous. One of the scenes where they're sitting by the public garden in Boston is arguably one of the most famous monologues in all of film. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And so the film also won for Best Screenplay. So Matt and Ben won an Oscar for Best Screenplay. So just a little bit of background on the film. I think the budget was $10 million, and I think it grossed over $235 million. So needless to say, it was a massive success. And so the movie begins with Matt Damon's character, Will Hunting, sitting in his apartment in Southie, in South Boston. And he's kind of voraciously reading as you know, he's just sitting there, and it kind of zooms out and you see a very kind of barren apartment, kind of disheveled, mattress on the floor, not a lot of furniture. And this is kind of a metaphor, right? Here you have this person who is absolutely brilliant. Just, I mean, the smartest person around, and yet his life is empty. And so this kind of sets the tone. And then you have the scene with Ben Affleck, who is playing the character Chucky, who's Will's best friend. He shows up to pick Will up, as he does every day, to take him to work. And you kind of get the sense for this friend group. So then you have the introduction of Stellan Skarsgård, who plays Professor Gerald Lambo, who is a professor at MIT, who we go on to learn is very successful, has won accolades and prizes and things like that. And so he is teaching a advanced mathematics theorem class, I don't know, at MIT, and he presents the class with a problem that they are to solve, and he puts it out in the hallway, and he says, if you can solve this, you know, I can't remember if he offers extra credit or what have you, but it's one of these kind of really, really difficult problems. And then you see Will, who is a janitor at MIT. He's buffing the floors, and he comes across the chalkboard with the problem. And, oh, this is interesting. And you kind of go to later in the day, and Will is out with his friends, but he's kind of thinking about this problem. So he ends up going home, and he's writing on his mirror, and he's kind of putting it together, and he ends up solving this problem, right? He goes, he writes it on the chalkboard, doesn't want to take credit for it. And so the professor sees this, and he's like, oh, wow, the next day in class, who wants to step forward and take their prize? This is incredible. And nobody raises their hand to claim the prize. And so they're all kind of befuddled around, okay, well, who did this? And so they end up putting another problem on the board. And this one, they kind of up the ante. This one is really challenging. Of course, Matt Damon, or Will Hunting, is able to do it, but this time he's caught. Right? So Professor Lambeau sees him, kind of confronts him, and Will, in his kind of hostile way, ends up yelling expletives at him and walks off. But this, like, wow, he did this problem correct too. And so Professor Lambeau at this point is like, okay, I need to figure out who this is, and we need to talk. So at this point, we see Will with his friends, and they're at a baseball game, and they run into an old friend named Carmine who actually bullied Will. So they end up antagonizing him, getting into a fight, and it's a vicious fight. Like you kind of see Will's aggressiveness, his anger, his hostility on display as he's hitting him back and forth. They have to be pulled off, and then the police come, and he ends up hitting the police. So he goes to jail. And you learn while he's in jail that he has a long rap sheet, that he was in at least 3 foster care homes where he was brutalized. So he was beaten, he was abused, and you kind of are introduced that, oh wow, this is a kid who's had a really, really hard time. And Professor Lambeau is there watching the trial, and he ends up striking a deal with Will that if you will come work with me and go to therapy, then I will kind of vouch for you and get you out of jail. So ultimately, he takes him up on the deal, but he doesn't want to go to therapy, right? And so this is consistent with the avoidance piece, right? There's this, I don't want to confront these feelings. I don't want to, feel any of the pain, fear, abandonment, any of those old feelings associated with the trauma. And so it's kind of comical. He ends up meeting 2 therapists, and he does his homework before the session so he can exploit them. And he kind of just kind of toys with them in session. And then so finally, Jerry, Professor Lambeau, goes to an old friend, Sean McGuire, who is played by Robin Williams. And there's an interesting dynamic between Sean and Jerry. So they're old friends. They actually were college roommates, I believe. So they're both brilliant. And Sean kind of took a different path. Instead of kind of rising to stardom and the top of his profession, he became a college professor at a technical college. In fact, when we meet Sean, he's leading a class at a local community college, and he's talking about trust, which is going to be instrumental in his work later on with Will. And so Jerry and Sean talk, and Sean agrees to meet with him, and so we have the first meeting between Will and Sean, and it's a great beginning to their relationship. Will starts out very calculated. He's gathering intel, right? He's looking around the room. He's asking questions. He's deflecting. He's trying to control the narrative. And at one point, he walks over to a painting of Sean's. We learned that Sean did the painting, and it's kind of pastel watercolor almost, and it's of a figure, a person on a boat in a storm. And so Will kind of starts to, tease apart kind of what is this symbolism of this for Sean. And he talks about his wife and how he you know, it was the wrong partner for him, and he was isolated. And anyways, it really kind of triggers Sean. And at one point, Sean says, um, I can't remember what he says, but at one point he grabs him by the neck, and he basically is like, "Don't ever talk about my wife again, or I will end you." And so it's a scene where you're kind of, whoa. I'm watching this movie, and my mouth is open at certain points of the movie, and you know, wow, here's this therapist, this professional, and bam, I mean, he grabs him by the throat and throws him up against the wall, and he's like, you know, obviously this is dramatic. You wouldn't hopefully not see this in real life, right? Certainly never grabbed a client by the throat, but he's setting a boundary. He's making it clear, all right, this is off limits. And this is important, particularly in people with, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, but really in any kind of therapeutic alliance. It's, here are the boundaries, right? And I'm going to be consistent and clear with these boundaries. And to me, that's what he's doing. And so you think at that point, oh, well, there's no way he's going to, you know, continue to work with Will. But he tells Jerry, yeah, I want to work with him. I want to get to know him. And so kind of during this time, there's another famous scene where they go to, Will and his friends go to a bar, Harvard bar, and they're having drinks and stuff. And Chucky, played by Ben Affleck, sees a pair of girls, and he's like, "Oh, watch this! I'm gonna go talk to him." And so he goes up to him, and he starts, you know, trying to be smooth. And so one of the girls is Minnie Driver, who plays the character Skylar, and he's kind of sweet talking him. And at this point, this, you know, buttoned up fella in a white or a blonde ponytail walks up, and he starts intellectualizing and trying to belittle Chucky by quoting historical facts, literature. It's above my head. So Will sees this going on, and Will intervenes, and Will goes toe to toe with this guy, and just, I mean, demolishes him, right? You see Will is just, I mean, he is so sharp. He's absolutely brilliant. And at the end of his tirade, he's like, but, you know, we can step outside. You know, again, he's threatening him. You see this kind of hostility. But he ends up walking away, diffuses the situation. But Skylar takes note of this. And ultimately, she gives Will her number. So they're leaving the bar, and this famous scene where Will kind of sees the ponytail guy and knocks on the glass of the restaurant or the bar he's in, and smacks the napkin up against the wall and says, "How you like them apples?" Right? So there's a famous quote from the movie. And so now we have kind of the connection between Skylar and Will, which is going to play a central role in the movie, as Will kind of begins his journey towards working through his fear of abandonment, being vulnerable and taking risks, right? Which runs counter to the avoidance from his PTSD. And so he kind of goes back to starting his work with Sean. And for the first couple of appointments, they literally sit in silence. I can tell you, as a therapist, for me, it's hard. Like, I can tolerate maybe a couple minutes of silence, but multiple sessions of silence, it's pretty impressive. But Sean makes the statement to Jerry that he's got to start. He has to be the one to initiate this. And that's important, right? Because Sean is wanting to establish a collaborative relationship with Will. He's not wanting to be another authority figure. He's not wanting to be another oppressor in his life. He wants to empower Will. He wants to give Will control, right? So that when Will is able to initiate conversation, there's more buy-in, right? There's this implied message that it matters what you have to say, Right? We're not here for my agenda. I want to know you. Right? And he goes on to kind of talk about this later on. Let me back up for a minute. I missed the arguably the best part of the movie. So before they have the sessions of silence, Sean is seen kind of really, really struggling with what Will said about the painting, right? And, throwing out there that he married the wrong woman. We learn that Sean's wife died of cancer, and this was obviously very painful for Sean. And we hear that, we hear that they had an incredible relationship, and so the scene is of Sean sitting in his apartment. The dishes are piled up, and he's drinking, and he just looks really distraught. Ultimately, the next session, Will comes to his office, and Sean says, "Let's take a walk." This is where they go to the public garden. And I've actually been to this bench, the actual bench where this scene was filmed, and it's been memorialized since Robin Williams passed away. But they sit, and Sean delivers a monologue, and I can't obviously not do it justice, but I'll give you the gist of it. Sean shares with Will kind of how he was affected by what he said about the painting. Basically that you see one painting and you presume to know who I am and rip my fucking life apart, right? And then he says that it occurred to him that Will had never been out of Boston, right? That he could quote you Shakespeare and literature and mathematics and all these things, but he couldn't tell you what it smelled like in the Sistine Chapel. He couldn't tell you what it was like to wake up next to a woman and feel totally vulnerable and in love. He couldn't tell you what it's like to be in war, because we know that Sean is a war veteran. He couldn't tell you what it's like to lose someone that you love, to be with them even through cancer. And he goes on to speculate that Will is an orphan. And he says, "Do you think I would presume to know anything about you from reading Oliver Twist? Does that encapsulate you?" And this is like, he's framing it in a way that's like, oh wow, like such a powerful monologue that he's giving. And he kind of then switches gears a little bit, and he's like, if you want to talk about you, I'm in. I'm fascinated. But I can't do it for you. And so you're gonna have to make the next move. So he finishes with, "Your move, Chief." And so I have goosebumps, literally goosebumps, thinking about this scene. It is so powerful. And of course, Will is sitting there totally disarmed, right? Totally quiet, because Sean's got his number. Sean has got his number. And then this is where we move on to the sessions in silence. And so finally, Will breaks his silence, right? And he does it with kind of some humor, right? He uses humor a lot to deflect, amongst other things. The girl that he's met, Skylar, and at one point he says, "This girl's perfect, but I don't want to screw it up." And Sean is like, "Oh, that's a terrific mentality to have." And this introduces a key theme in the film, kind of captured by the cliche. It's better to have loved than lost, to have never loved at all, right? And this is evident in Sean, because he's had this love, the love of his life, who's died. It was incredibly painful, just as you can imagine. And so Sean goes on to tell a story about his wife farting in her sleep, and at one time she farted and woke her up, and he didn't have the heart to tell her it was her, so he took the blame. I learned in researching the film, this was totally improvised. This was not scripted. Robin Williams came up with this on the fly, and Matt Damon is dying laughing. It's a genuine laugh. And if you look closely, you can see the camera shake. This is the cameraman laughing, right? So this is just an example of Robin Williams and how he was able to kind of infuse the comedy into this situation. But it's also kind of reinforcing this theme of, if you're going to live your life in isolation, avoiding any possibility of harm, you're also going to miss out on what makes life worth living. You're going to miss out on these experiences and the joy and the beauty of emotion, right? Because Will is trying to avoid emotion. And so it's also, if you look at it from a therapeutic standpoint, Sean is trying to challenge his thinking, kind of correcting the schema that Will has, that he lives his life by, which is, I'm going to push you away before you can get close enough to hurt me. And as a result, he's never been out of Boston. He's never had any real kind of authentic relationships, and never really experienced life. He's been very isolated. And so Sean is trying to slowly kind of introduce this idea to Will. At this point, Will and Skylar's relationship is beginning to progress. They've been intimate. They're hanging out more. It's obvious that they've got a lot of chemistry. And so it comes to a head when Skylar, she's supposed to move to California, and she asks Will to come with her. And this spooks Will. And Will automatically goes on the defense. He starts yelling. He becomes agitated. It kind of almost attacks her, because, again, he's now faced with kind of moving into this vulnerable space of, oh, this is real. This is now moving into something where I could be hurt. And so he goes on the attack. At the end of the scene, she's professing her love for him, and she asks, if you don't love me, I will leave. And immediately, it's stone cold, he says, I don't love you. And we know this isn't true, but it's so convincing and it's automatic. You can just see it's very, very powerful, this defense that is present in him. He is not going to let her in at this point. He's just not ready. And so we end up arriving at a scene between Chucky and Will. This is another critical scene in the film. So Chucky, again, played by Ben Affleck, he's one of the guys. He's a blue-collar worker working in construction, doesn't have an education, doesn't have a lot of prospects or aspirations beyond what he's doing now, and he's happy, and that's fine. But he kind of challenges Will, and he's like, look, you're sitting on a winning lottery ticket, and you're too much of a chicken to cash it in. If you're still living here in 5-10 years, I'm going to be pissed. He says the best part of his day is when he comes to pick up Will, and he walks up to the door and he knocks on the door, and for a moment he hopes that Will doesn't answer, that he's kind of moved on and gone on to do something great. And again, this really disarms Will, right? This is someone who is absolutely loyal to Will. Chucky and a group of friends, unconditional love. They would die for him. And this is why he has close relationships with them, because he has been able to overcome that fear because of that fierce loyalty. But I think this, again, kind of challenges Will's mindset a little bit. And so finally we get to, again, it's hard to say the most powerful scene, but certainly a monumental scene in the film, where Will comes to Sean's office, and Sean is getting ready to kind of finish up his paperwork and send in a report to the judge, right? And so Will is kind of half curious about it, and in the file, Sean has pictures of bruising and kind of what Will went through in foster care, and he relates to him a bit. He shares that his father was abusive, and that Sean does, that he was an alcoholic and was abusive and mean. And so then Will reciprocates and opens up a little bit about how his foster father at one point used to, I think, put a stick, a belt, and a wrench and say, "You pick." And so at this point, Sean kind of steps close to Will and he says, "It's not your fault." And Will kind of brushes it off. And Sean steps closer. Again, "It's not your fault." Again, Will brushes it off. Again, "It's not your fault." And then again. And this time, when Sean says it, you see Will's hair peels back. It's a subtle point in the film, but there's this, his hair peels back and he's pinning his ears back, right? He's baring his teeth. He's getting ready. And he says, "Not you, Sean, not you." And you could see it, he's getting ready to fight. Again, "It's not your fault," right? And then he breaks through. He cries, he breaks down, he embraces Sean, and he says, "I'm so sorry." And it's just, he's done it. He's taken him to the precipice, and he has given Will an opportunity to step into his fear, right? And Sean has done a beautiful job of kind of modeling for Will, this is what a secure relationship looks like, right? I'm gonna be here for you. I'm gonna put up with all of your defensive strategies. I'm gonna have boundaries. I'm gonna be authentic. I'm gonna give you this unconditional, positive regard. I'm going to relate, right? I'm gonna share. We're gonna collaborate. All these super, super important things that Will's never experienced before. Certainly not from his caregivers, which is where you learn these things early on in life, where you learn empathy, you learn safety, you learn how to trust. And so Sean has recreated that in the therapeutic setting. And so this is kind of when we get to the treatment, I'm going to highlight the Therapeutic Alliance. And, we can talk about treatments for PTSD all day long, and that's great, but I think the Therapeutic Alliance is what's at the forefront of this film. We don't really see any kind of therapeutic modality at play. You could pull out some perhaps cognitive elements that Sean is using, but it is absolutely shedding a spotlight on the therapeutic relationship. And there are studies that show this is the most powerful corrective measure in therapy. Just the relationship itself and creating this secure attachment, which Sean does beautifully in the film. And so this is where kind of, okay, now there's the tables have turned. And so Will, he then goes and he accepts a job. And then finally at the end of the film, he leaves a note for Sean. And basically the note says, "I've gone to see about a girl." And this is a reference to something Sean said earlier about when he missed the World Series game because he met his wife and he told his buddies, "I've got to see about a girl." And so it's a beautiful ending, and the final scene is Will driving to California. So kind of leaves some, up to your imagination about what happens, but he's going to see Skylar. So there's also a scene right at the end where Chucky pulls up to Will's house, knocks on the door, he's not there, and he kind of smiles and gets back in the car. So that's the movie in a nutshell, and it's just I could go on and on about how great it is, but so to talk about the themes in the movie, again, to me the theme is better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. And I also think, for me, we talk about having an emotional mind, a reasonable mind, and then a wise mind. So emotional mind it's the part of us that is fast, creative, hot, and joyous and scared, afraid, mad, all of these things that are critical for life. They give life purpose and meaning, truly. They give life purpose and meaning. Without it, we would have no purpose, no meaning. Critical. But if it is left to its own devices, it can be very destructive, right? Because emotions, again, they're not smart. So if I act based on emotion alone, I'm reduced to the animal level, and I'm not going to survive. So then we have the reasonable mind, right? This is the part of us that can, again, govern, right, the emotional mind, right? It's kind of the brake pedal. It can weigh the pros and cons. It can think critically. It can plan. It can calculate. It can draw inferences. It can abstract. It can do all these incredible things to give us the best possible path forward as far as the decisions that we make and the actions that we take, right? So we need this. So we see in the film, Will is reasonable mind. He is intellect, right? That's what he uses. That's where he lives, right? He's not going into the emotional mind. Too dangerous. It's too dark. It's all intellect. Wise mind, right? This is where we balance the two. We bring them in concert with each other. Reasonable, emotional, right? We're not too far in one or the other. We're perfectly balanced, right? We're seeing the message of our emotions. We're incorporating them into logic, and we're using that to be effective, right? And so, to me, this is where we end up, right? Will is kind of, he's faced his fear of abandonment. He's now willing to step out into this vulnerable space where Skylar could say, "Get out of here," you don't know, but he's willing to do it. He's now willing to do it, and so these are important themes. And then finally, as far as treatment goes, again, we talked about EMDR before. EMDR is certainly an evidence-based treatment. There's another therapy called prolonged exposure, or PE, but I won't get into these because I wanted to focus again on the Therapeutic Alliance and the relationship that is born in therapy, because this is the magic. This is the good stuff, and this film does a great job of showing you the power of Sean and Will's relationship. Without it, nothing would have been accomplished. And Sean does a number of things that I think are crucial. And I've already talked about it, so I won't belabor the point. But right up front, he sets a boundary, right? Grab him by the throat. He has a pretty fierce boundary, but again, he's setting a boundary, right? He's saying, this is kind of the parameters, right? This is what's okay. This is what's not okay. And if we step outside of that, here's what's going to happen, right? And this is made explicit early on, right? And then he's vulnerable, right? He models for Will what it's like to be real. He talks about his wife. He talks about his pain. He talks about being with her through cancer. And he's also not afraid to challenge Will, right? The scene on the bench where he's basically saying, look, this isn't working for you. This is not working for you. If you want to get real, I'm in, man. I'm fascinated, right? So he's empowering him. He's validating him. He's saying that I want to go there and be with you. And this has a remarkable impact. When somebody values you and makes you feel valued, is so powerful. And it creates momentum. It really creates momentum to change. And we see that. He basically models for Will what it's like to be in a secure relationship, right? Where it's safe, you can trust him. He's not going to bullshit him. He's going to tell him the truth. He's not going to sugarcoat things, but he's also going to love you no matter what. And this shines brightly in the film. It is just on full display. So this is so important. Really, I mean, even beyond therapy. I mean, this is true for parents, for sure. This is true for friendships. This is true for medical providers, right? And just healthy relationships. But particularly in the therapeutic setting is having these in place is crucial if any work is going to be done. So that's Good Will Hunting, and that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Incredible film, just Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and Robin Williams, uh, uh, out of the park, A plus, all of the things. So thank you for tuning in. Keep your minds open and your screens lit.